Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. On today's episode, my guest is Heidi Brown. She is a professor at Brooklyn Law School and the author of a book called The Introverted Lawyer. And I don't even know what to tell you. This is such a fascinating conversation, something different from what we often do on this program, but a conversation about what it means to be an introvert, to have anxiety, to have shyness, to have the qualities of somebody who gets their energy from and needs the recharging of energy in ways that introverts do is wildly different from extroverts, say. And in the world of law, where we have this idea that lawyers are brash and loud and arrogant and have no problem whatsoever getting up on their feet in front of a judge or a jury, what we really have to understand is that backstage, so to speak, there's all kinds of things going on, and we have a lot to learn about those qualities of how we deal with who we are psychologically, emotionally, and even physically, how we posture ourselves, how we sit, and what are some things that we can do to be more effective. These are things that go way beyond law to all walks of life, whether you work in a small firm or in a big office building, frankly, in any relationship. My conversation with Heidi, I think, has some really interesting insights, no matter what you're looking at or talking about in that sense. So, great episode on what it means to be an introvert and how to overcome that, and how to deal with that in life as well as in law. Stay tuned. On today's episode, my guest is Heidi Brown. She is a professor of law at Brooklyn Law School currently, and she's the author of a fascinating book that I read last night called The Introverted Lawyer. So we're going to be talking about what that means, a book that was written from her really fascinating personal experience and professional experience, with an eye towards sharing that experience with lawyers who may not fit the stereotypical mold of the bold, brash, loud-speaking, aggressive attorney. But I think so many lessons here that apply well outside of the lawyer experience to each and every one of us, both those who may be introverted in some way or another, to some degree or another, or may know somebody or work with somebody who is introverted in some way. So first of all, Heidi, thank you and welcome to Good Law, Bad Law. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is really a departure for us on this program, but I was so struck by the idea of the book, and then reading through it last night, see so many lessons, not only for lawyers, for lawyers and law students, but also for really anybody in the workplace or in any interpersonal relationship. So I'm very excited to be speaking with you about this. I guess what I was hoping you would start with is, what is an introvert?
That's such a great question, because in our American society, we sort of lump together labels around quiet, naturally quiet folks. So we might call a quiet person, introverted, or they're so shy, or they might be deemed to be aloof or antisocial. But really, all of those labels represent completely different categories of individuals. So introversion and extroversion are the ways that we as individuals process information and stimuli and questions and just life coming at us. And they also describe different approaches toward the way we rekindle energy. So introverts just use an internal process. There's actually science that shows, they did some studies that show that introverts and extroverts actually use different neurological pathways in our brains. So extroverts use a shorter pathway. When, say, someone asks a question, the extrovert is ready to jump into that conversation faster. There's a shorter linkage between the question and when the extrovert will start speaking and engaging. But the introvert takes a longer time to process information internally. It doesn't mean that we're not smart or not competent or not prepared. It's just we like to vet and test our ideas and theories and solutions to problems internally, inside our brains, before sharing them with others. And then introversion also reflects the way that we rekindle energy. We can be very social and outgoing at parties or networking events, but we get drained by those events, whereas extroverts gain energy from those types of scenarios. So you'll see that introverts need to go into a quiet office or go home to your apartment or home or sit in your car and kind of process what you just interacted with, but also to rekindle energy in solitude and quietude.
Yeah, my wife often compares herself to her best friend. Her best friend can go to night after night of parties and hanging out with friends, and my wife will often say, I need quiet time. I need some time just to decompress and be quiet, and often even be by herself. And I think that's important to understand about somebody, because it can have a real impact on how you function in a group environment, whether it's in a workplace or, as we'll soon talk about, in a courtroom or any type of public speaking, or how you relate to somebody else who may function very different from you in terms of how you give off energy and how you rekindle that energy, as you said.
Yes, and I used to feel like there was something wrong with me, that I was so tired after events like that, or after going to court, or after a long day of depositions, like I was somehow weak. But in reality, it just is a different way of me processing those experiences. And I actually really love being alone. I love traveling alone. I love just being by myself and reading. And then I can really thrive and work much harder and perform at a much higher level. So I want to really encourage introverts to embrace that part of our personalities. It doesn't mean that we're being antisocial. It's we know how we can thrive and be really high-performing individuals if we allow ourselves that time to just be alone and rekindle energy.
And I definitely want to get to that part of your book and your work and things that you've learned, life lessons from your own experience, as far as how people can understand themselves better and really put into practice certain things to help them deal with situations that they might not necessarily and naturally be comfortable with. You outline 7 steps that people can follow, and that's a really fascinating part of the work that you've done. But to get there, I think it would really be so helpful and really fascinating for you to talk about some of your own experience. I hope that's okay. You do go through all of that in the book, really starting with how you came to law, how you came to even think of law, given the really powerful and graphic stereotypes I know so many of us have about what it means to be a lawyer. I once had somebody say to me, "Gosh, you're a good arguer. You should be a lawyer." And there's others too. But how you came to law and how what happened on 9/11 really changed your life, because that, I think, launches us into the first really important phase of your own journey.
Right. Yes. So going back to what led me to go to law school, I was never one of those kids that people said, "Oh, you're going to make a great lawyer." I was not the kid that argued all the time or tried to negotiate things. I was a very quiet, studious kid all through elementary school and high school. And I loved college because I loved research and writing. And, going to a university at the college level, you can sometimes, I don't want to say get away with, but you can be a great student and sit in class and be really engaged and high performing, but not participate, not raise your hand and talk all the time. And I studied a lot of languages in college. I actually loved college. But I didn't have to speak in front of large groups of people. So you might not think of me as being a person naturally drawn to law school. I actually had thought about going to medical school, but I think I mentioned this in the book that growing up, we had a St. Bernard dog, and my parents would take me to the vet, and I could not handle it when the doctors would take blood from our poor dog. So I figured my medical career was over before it started.
That's a non-starter.
Right. So But I had great professors in college that really encouraged me to consider law school. So I applied and I got in, and they emphasized the research and writing aspect of law school. And of course, that really attracted me to that educational experience. So I got into law school. I was 21 when I went to law school, and I had no idea what I was getting into. My father's a minister. My mom was a piano teacher and an interior designer. So I really didn't have any, other than what I saw on TV, I didn't have any clear expectations of what law school would be. And of course, I got a very rude awakening when I walked into my first class, and the professors were all using the Socratic method and cold calling. And frankly, I was terrified. I spent a lot of time my first year of law school being scared out of my mind and feeling like I had made a mistake. But I loved the substance of what I was learning. I didn't understand all of it, but I loved it. I felt intellectually stimulated. I thrived in my legal research and writing class. I really liked certain aspects of school, but the performance components of it, having to speak in class, feeling like all my classmates were good at that and excited about it, I pushed myself into certain activities thinking, sort of listening to all the cliche advice, just do it or just fake it till you make it, and just the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. I tried all of those techniques and nothing seemed to be changing, so I really felt like it was just a personal weakness. And that attitude or approach, not a very healthy one, took me straight through my 3 years of law school and then a very high-pressure job. And I look back on that, and I so wish I knew then what I know now about myself in terms of being an introvert, but also my ability to be able to do it and bring something to the table that is a real asset, but that we don't always talk about out loud and don't always appreciate in legal education and the practice.
Yeah, and it's not that research and writing and quiet study and analysis are not important parts of the way lawyers are taught in law school, or the way young lawyers are raised up in law firms, because it is. But there are these other aspects of legal education and early life as a lawyer that kind of are, I think, the glory moments in where you're up on your feet in front of an audience or in front of a judge, or practicing to do that, or being good at being called at and on the spot, being capable and competent in taking on a professor who's picking you out, perhaps out of a class of 200 people with everybody looking. I mean, it can be very terrifying. I remember, my first days in a big law firm. I didn't last very long in the big law firm. It wasn't for me. But I remember a number of the other new lawyers who were starting when I started. I was older when I went to law school. I was 31 when I went to law school. I had a whole other career before law school. But I remember as we were being handed out our first assignments as new lawyers in this big law firm, and I didn't want to go sit in the library. I was ready to get up on my feet and do things. And there were a lot of people that said, you know what, let them send me to the library. I'm very happy to be left alone. And so it's obvious that there were different approaches that people had and different ways that people were comfortable doing what they were doing and being asked to do. But you can be thrown into some pretty deep and choppy waters, and you're expected to swim, and you're expected to do it, whether it's in law school or after you get out of law school. And I think, as I understand it, you found that was, you were doing it, and you were doing it well and successfully, but there was something that told you that really wasn't for you.
Yes, and I wish like I said, I wish I could go back and redo the first 15 years of my legal career, because I had great mentors at my first law firm who did appreciate writing skills and research skills, but we were sort of thrown into taking depositions and going to court. And I loved the work I was doing. We practiced construction litigation, so every case was very interesting and intellectually complicated, and we had to learn about engineering and architecture and soils, and that part I loved. But I always felt like there was something wrong with me when I was going up in a deposition against really gregarious, outspoken opposing counsel or I was going to court, and everybody seemed to be just loving it. And I struggled with that a lot. But now I look back on that, and I know I could have done it better if I had known more about myself and situations that do make me nervous and how that affects how I physically walk into the room and how I sit, even things that seem as minor as that. I could have done a much better job. The message that I either misinterpreted or interpreted over the years was, well, you just chose the wrong type of law. Why'd you go into litigation? Or why'd you go into law in the first place? But I don't think that's the right message. I see now I teach law, and I see my quiet students are often my most thoughtful problem solvers. They're creative problem solvers. They are good researchers and writers. But when they're given the opportunity to speak in their own way, they come up with incredible solutions to complex situations. And so I don't think our message should be, oh, okay, you're quiet or you don't like the fight, if we want to describe it like that. So maybe you should go do something else or do a non-confrontational type of law. I think the message should be, okay, well, your assets are your quiet thinking, your researching, your writing, but you can do the performance aspects of our job. But here's a way that you can amplify your voice when you need to, but in a way that's authentic for you. Like for me, I always thought I had to mirror my opposing counsel, who was pounding the table and screaming and sometimes throwing things. And I felt like I wasn't good enough if I wasn't acting like that. But that is, now I know, 2 decades later, that's not who I am. That's not how I excel. That's not what I bring to the table. I can still be a great negotiator or a great public speaker if I do it naturally, but just more amplified when I need to amplify myself. But I do not need to be extroverted or gregarious or combative. Not that extroverts are all combative, but and they're not at all. But being extroverted and gregarious is not my style, and that's okay.
Well, and we don't learn about these things. We don't, that is to say, learn about ourselves in law school. And I imagine that's also true as people are thinking about going into other professions and other types of work generally. We don't think about what are my natural qualities, what are things that help me work effectively, what are things that perhaps are obstacles to my working effectively. That's just not something that's talked about at all for the most part, I think. And we could do a lot better at how we raise up young lawyers. And again, I think this is applicable far outside the bounds of just law and legal education. But generally, we could do a much better job of helping people understand the things that they're naturally better and more comfortably inclined towards.
I agree, and I think it can help on several levels, not only on an individual basis to help individuals grow and be fulfilled in their work, but also do great work, but also teams. And we do a lot of our work as lawyers individually, but we also do need to work in teams, whether it's a trial team or a negotiating team or any type of office environment is just a team. And the more we know about how each of us operates best and operates and interacts with other people, we can be so much more effective instead of just kind of sticking to that sort of, in my mind, outdated stereotype of what makes the quote-unquote good lawyer or good or aggressive lawyer. We don't all need to be that way to be really effective. And the more we know about each other, I think our law office communities can function as a unit much better, and also will individually be a lot happier.
Well, okay? So now that we've said that, though, I'll tell you what's going through my thoughts, and I don't know if this will feel like pushing back on that, or maybe it's just a matter of differentiating or looking at some of the nuances here, because many people have outright phobia, if not fear, anxiety, discomfort over the idea of, let's say, speaking in public, or getting up on their feet and having people look at them while they have to give an oral argument to a judge or a presentation in a meeting or whatever it might be. I am a trial lawyer, and I've been doing this for almost 25 years, and I can't tell you the number of people who've said to me, boy, when you get up on your feet, it's like you're not nervous at all. And I say, you didn't see me before I walked into the courtroom. If you had, you'd have found me in the bathroom, because I'm always nervous before I get up on my feet. I'm always uncomfortable inside, but I've learned. And so I guess what that's making me think is, people can develop skills. They can develop techniques for dealing with anxiety, stress, discomfort. Some people can master that. I mean, I remember reading a Malcolm Gladwell book. I think it was David and Goliath, and he talks about David Boies, one of the most prominent trial lawyers, and some would say controversial too, who discovered in law school that he had severe dyslexia. And we know the volumes that you have to read just to get through law school, and what he had to do to overcome that, and let alone become as highly successful as he is. I mean, but so where, isn't there something to be said for encouraging people to push through things they may not be uncomfortable with, to become more comfortable with them, to develop skills that they might not think that they can have and develop? And where does, so how do we separate out those kinds of gentle and constructive, and maybe even sometimes forceful pushing that we all sometimes need to do something we're not comfortable with or not experienced with, or have even strong anxiety about doing, versus the kinds of things you're talking about, recognizing that different people can be fundamentally built differently.
Yes, and I want to make it very clear that I'm not at all advocating for quiet folks opting out of situations where we have to get up in front of people and speak. In fact, my whole mission and philosophy towards teaching new lawyers is that instead of just throwing them into situations without any guidance, like cold calling students in class or just telling junior associates, just go to court, you have to do this, just face your fear. Because I interpreted those messages for years. Just do it, face your fear, do something every day that scares you. Even messages like, if you're not nervous, it means you don't care enough, so it's good to be nervous, and things like that. Those messages, I'm just saying, those types of messages are not helpful to help a person, as you just described, step into a performance moment that ultimately will be good for them down the road. Instead, I want to say, okay, we get that this is scarier for some of us than others. That's okay. It doesn't mean we're not cut out for this profession. It doesn't mean we can't do it. It doesn't mean we don't deserve to be here. We do. So now let's acknowledge that we're scared. Now let's figure out what we can do about it, because we can actually do something about it. And I will tell you, 5 years ago, I never could have gotten up in front of as many people as I speak in front of now and been able to do it. I couldn't have. I either would have said no, or I would have been, as you described, hiding in the bathroom, which I did before every single deposition. Every court appearance, I would hide and feel sick and feel terrible about myself, but also physically. And now I know I can, if I manage my mental soundtrack, and I also understand how my stress manifests physically, I can prepare myself on the. I'm always substantively prepared to present in front of people, but my mental and physical reactions get in the way. So now that I've done all this work on myself, I understand, okay, no, this is just my normal fear happening again. I have to remind myself of all the prep work I've done. I know what I'm talking about. And then the physical side, I am very aware now of what I'm doing physically. That's my instinctive or automatic physical reaction to try to protect me from a perceived threat. But I know that the way my physical body reacts is not actually helpful, because I try to get really small. I cross my arms. I have a very robust blushing response, so everything is just going haywire. But I have to stop and calm myself down. And I have this thing where I try to treat myself like an athlete. Okay, so what would an athlete do? An athlete would stand in a balanced stance or sit in a balanced stance. And so I'm able to do techniques like that, and then I can step into the performance way better than I ever could 5 years ago. Now, I think that if we talk more openly about the fear or the phobia or the public speaking anxiety or whatever, however we want to describe it, if we talk more openly about it, instead of just saying, go do this, it's good for you, you need to be able to do this, instead we really break down the mental components, the emotional components, the physical components, and I like the word untangle it. Instead of just conquer it, let's get to know it and then come up with processes and techniques that are probably different for every individual, but that can enable every single person to be able to go out there and do it. And obviously, it's not always going to go perfectly. I still have terrible, presentations, but I know how to put myself in the best position to do it well and come through it and actually sometimes really enjoy it, which I never did when I was a lot younger.
Well, I think we all have to do our own form of preparation. Again, I almost feel like a change comes over me. I describe it as when the lights come on, and it's showtime, in front of a jury or in front of a judge. I almost feel like something in me has converted, and all the, and that's a good thing. And I've learned how to do that, because up until that moment when those lights come on, so to speak, I'm a wreck. I'm pacing, I'm nervous, I'm sweating, my stomach is upset, all those things. We all have different reactions. But then I've almost trained myself, and maybe I didn't even know I was doing that. But I love how, how you describe a process that anybody can engage in, that process of getting to know themselves. But before we get to that, as I really don't want to miss the opportunity to ask this, for those of us who lived through 9/11, it's a moment that changed all of our lives. But again, in your own journey to understanding yourself better, to the point where you could really help so many people understand themselves better, you have a particularly extraordinary 9/11 story that I think was pretty important in your journey. I would love it if you'd share that.
It really was an enormous turning point for me in my personal growth. So I had my original law firm that I worked at for 6 years after law school. Again, I described it a little earlier, but it was a very educational training experience. But around 2000, I went through a really traumatic relationship split, and I ended up moving to New York. And I landed a job in big law in one of the towers at the World Trade Center. And I was still having a really rough time emotionally and mentally because of that relationship trauma. And I ended up taking a leave of absence. And I was traveling on the week before 9/11 happened. And on September 10th, I happened to be flying home from Europe. I spent the night in the Athens airport, and I had a connecting flight in the wee hours of the morning of 9/11. So I was on a plane flying home to the United States, and the pilot diverted the plane to Newfoundland, Canada, a town called Gander. And I didn't know what was going on. None of the passengers knew what was going on. And as you may have read and seen, 39 planes were grounded in Gander, Newfoundland. And they kept us on the plane for what I recall around 12 hours, and slowly information started trickling in about what had happened. And while I was sitting on that plane, grounded, waiting to figure out what was going on and get off the plane, I realized I finally understood what had happened to the towers. And it just hit me tremendously that I could have been there.
Because your office, had you not taken the leave of absence, your office was in one of the Twin Towers.
Yes, my office was in the South Tower. I hadn't even cleaned out my office yet. I was still on this leave. So it really hit me that I was so lucky because, first of all, I wasn't there. And it was the reason why I wasn't there was because I had to be honest with myself about how much I was struggling emotionally and mentally. And I needed time to figure out who I was and what I was going to do with my life. And then I realized I was so lucky that I wasn't on one of those planes. I was on a different plane. So ultimately, the Canadians took all the passengers off these planes, and there were 6,000 or 7,000 passengers that were grounded in Gander, and they took care of us and gave us clothes and food and toothbrushes because we couldn't get luggage off the flights. I slept on the floor of an elementary school for 5 days, and ultimately we had to fly back. The Lufthansa planes flew us, my plane, back to Germany, so then we could come and fly back into the United States. I had been connecting through Germany, which was very strange. So I finally got back into the United States, and then I flew into D.C., got back home to New York, and it just sunk in for me that here I'd been given this tremendous opportunity. I was alive, first of all, which I was very grateful, obviously. I hadn't been in the building. My law firm, thankfully, we didn't lose anybody in the law firm, although people had family members in the other towers. And I just started realizing I needed to honor the fact that I was honest enough with myself about how I was doing emotionally and really give myself this chance to figure out who I wanted to be as a lawyer and as a person. And it kind of just snapped me into action a little bit. I'd been in major relationship grief for that entire year and a half leading up to that. And this was just a wake-up call for me. And I started writing a book for junior attorneys about how litigation works. It was basically everything I wish I knew about litigation when I started. So I started thinking of myself as a writer. I ended up transitioning jobs to another very small boutique law firm, and I became a brief writer for that firm, which I knew was a better role for me. But inevitably, because the firm was pretty small, we had to do a lot of the performance activities anyway, and I ended up getting basically involved in these really intense litigations and having to take a lot of depositions again. But the 9/11 experience made me much more aware of who I wanted to be. I wasn't quite there yet, but it made me think about it a lot more. I had to do so much work on myself to process that experience, the Gander experience, the relationship trauma experience, and then just changing jobs again. This is the third firm I'd worked for. I saw a lot of the same patterns of leadership at the third firm that I'd experienced at the first two firms and my reactions to that. So it was a really pivotal time in my life. It still took me a good 5 to 7 years to kind of work through after that. But I'm so thankful that I had that experience, and it really has informed who I am today.
Well, and I think it's fascinating too, Heidi, that you apparently, I don't know if you considered this at the time or at points along the way, but you didn't turn away from law. I could easily see how that experience could lead a person to do that, to want to make so dramatic a change that they rethink entirely who they are in terms of their work identity. But you didn't do that ultimately, and found your way in the law. And you know, you'd said earlier that you loved the substance of the law. I too. I mean, I was a law school nerd. I loved the law. I still do. That's why I love doing this podcast on the side of my practice, because I love the law. It's so fascinating to me, and so rich and important. So how did you take that experience, which was, you know, really, for anybody who went through what you went through, would be a turning point experience in their life, and commit to the law and finding your own way into a place within the law that was more authentic and healthy and good for you?
Well, I'm so thankful to you for pointing that out, because I've never really thought about it that way, and I appreciate you pointing that out, because the 9/11 experience prompted me to write, because the way that I was processing all the emotions and the experience of being in Canada, and then processing the towers being gone, and the law firm had relocated to Midtown, and just there was so much confusion that my coping mechanism was to write, and that instinctively led me. So I was writing about all those experiences just to work through them, but it got me writing that book as well. And I started to find my way as a teacher and a writer of things that hopefully would help younger attorneys suffer less of the stress that I had experienced. And so I feel like the 9/11 experience, it kept me in the law because I wanted to, I guess, help other folks in the law be able to have a more fulfilled life experience in the law. And because it made me appreciate all the things I had enjoyed about my job, but also want to fix some of the things that I had really struggled with. So I think without the 9/11 experience, I probably wouldn't have started writing and reading so much about psychology and what drives us as performers. And I probably also wouldn't have sat down and written that very first book, which made me realize I love writing, and I have to write to feel healthy, to be honest. And it sparked my next phase of my career. I did stay in the law firm world for another 6 or 7 years after that, as I mentioned, but ultimately I ended up transitioning into law teaching, which I absolutely love, and I continue to write about issues that affect the profession. So I think you're right, and I never thought about 9/11 being that catalyst. But before 9/11, I had never written in those genres that I just described. I was a brief writer. That's all I had written. I mean, I'd written tons of other legal documents, but I had never written about the profession and being a lawyer.
Well, and also what you went through, and we would need a whole other hour, I think, to go into that in detail, but what you went through in those years, it did help you understand yourself better so that you could translate that in ways that other people could also benefit. And a lot of your book, because one size doesn't fit all, and the labels, are you an introvert or an extrovert? I mean, that doesn't really begin to tell the full story of who a person is, how they function, how they process, and so on. But you present exercises in the book, worksheets, ways for people to start to untangle themselves and who they are and how they function to better understand themselves, really is a very first step in the process of better finding your way, whatever it is you do. Again, here it's law, but it could be business, it could be an architecture firm, or it could be, I would say, even in a relationship. And we don't have time to go through all the 7 steps that you outline and discuss in great detail. I think people should get your book and they should read it, and we'll make sure that people know how to do that. But you said something, and I wonder if this is a way to get into the method, the overall approach that you brought to your own experience, and that you bring to the way you outline this for other people in the book. You said you learned how to manage your mental soundtrack. It's such a fascinating idea to me. Could you talk about that a little bit and how that guided you in understanding psychologically, physically, how you'd function and how you could pre-game, as you also describe it, and post-game even, certain moments to help you be more successful?
Yes. So one of the books that I read right after during my 9/11 experience was Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way. And that book, I had never really been a journaler before, but the book has this exercise that she recommends that every morning you just write 3 longhand pages of stream of consciousness writing. It's basically just to get thoughts out of your head and onto paper. And while I just started doing that as a daily thing. And I then read a whole bunch of books. Somehow I ended up getting into understanding the introvert-extrovert dichotomy, and also different books on social anxiety and shyness, which are totally different categories from introversion and extroversion. The shyness and social anxiety are more tied to a fear of criticism and a fear of judgment, which has nothing to do with introversion. But I had I had all of those categories. So doing the personal writing led me to understand that I have this very negative soundtrack about my performance abilities. And I had been again, I may have misinterpreted messages I got from past educators or people in positions of authority, but I was playing those same messages over and over again in my head every time I stepped into a deposition or I had to go deliver bad news to a kind of intimidating law firm partner, or I was in an argument with someone in my personal life or something like that. I was so fearful of failing, of being criticized. And once I started realizing that those negative messages were playing on a loop in my mind every time I was performing as a lawyer, and ultimately even when I became a law professor, I would walk into the classroom and have the same messages. But it really took me writing down what I was hearing in my head and transcribing those messages and trying to pinpoint, where have I heard this before? Why have I been telling myself this over the years, and are they true? Are these things that I'm telling myself about my abilities true? And I finally realized, no, I'm very prepared. I've done the work. I know what I'm talking about, but I was never giving myself that boost before I was going to perform. So part of what I learned and what has really helped me, and I tell the people, the students that I mentor and law firm associates that I talk to this all the time, until I sat down and realized how I was somewhat sabotaging myself, there was no way I was going to do better because I had no self-awareness. I didn't even realize what I was hauling into every performance with me. So it might sound a little touchy-feely, but this absolutely works. I had to identify those messages and then completely reframe my mental approach. So even today, when I have to go in or go into a room or go do a big talk, I still hear those messages. It's natural. They've been automatically programmed in my mind because I've been playing them for so long. But now I'm able to hear it and be like, oh, okay, well, this is just my soundtrack again. I have control. I'm going to remind myself that I've done the work. I know what I'm talking about. I care what I'm talking about. And if I reach one person in the room, I've done my job. And I know as lawyers, we want to reach sometimes more than one person in the room. But for me, that's enough for me to just stop that negativity enough to then make me recalibrate myself physically, because to me, the mental and the physical totally go hand in hand. And again, I try and bring in that athlete mentality a little bit, which I was never an athlete before I started doing this work. And it just does something to me that enables me to step into the moment and deliver my intellectual substance in a way that I never could have done before I started doing this. It has completely changed the way I operate. And I'm not the loudest person in the room. I'm not super gregarious, but I'm able to deliver a message that's so much more me, and I can do it well. And I never could have been able to do this if I had not analyzed this issue so deeply and done all that kind of personal mining of those old messages and all that stuff. It really makes a huge difference.
Well, and that does lead to one of the steps that you do outline. And again, when I talk about this kind of stuff with my wife, we call it private speech. We all engage in private speech where we're either giving fuel to the fire of some of those negative songs on our soundtrack, or we're confronting them and trying to change those messages within our own selves. So that's something, first of all, to be aware of and acknowledge in yourself, and then to become familiar with certain exercises that you can do to address that, as well as physical things that a person can do. You mentioned becoming aware of certain physical mannerisms that you might have that are expressions of anxiety or expressions of discomfort. And once you're aware that those exist, and we all have them, in one form or another, you can be conscious about that and change those. And that can actually make you feel more comfortable. Like you said about, assuming a balanced posture when you're on your feet speaking, or when you're seated. Those kinds of things can just physically make you feel better.
Yes, and one thing I talk about in the book that I'll just mention quickly right now is before, when I used to take all those depositions and go to court, I would always turn red and I would get very blotchy, and it looked like I was breaking out in hives. And I always worried that my opposing counsel could see that and would sense weakness. So I used to wear turtlenecks and scarves to all those events. But all that did was make me hotter and feel more constricted and like I was suffocating, which of course then exacerbated my heart beating faster. So it was just a mess. So, and it was all because I was self-conscious about someone seeing me turn red and thinking I was weak. So that's not a physical response that I could control or stop, but it took me researching it and realizing that this is just part of who I am. So there was this great book that I read by this woman named Erica Hilliard. This was in one of the shyness and social anxiety books. And she described a blush as life coursing through you. And I kind of laughed out loud when I read that comment because I thought, okay, well, I'm blushing. I'm alive. Yay me. But it reframed my relationship with that physical response that I can't change. You can't stop a blush from happening, but I can completely reframe my relationship with it. So I stopped wearing the turtlenecks and trying to hide everything, and now I know it's going to happen, but I immediately think, oh, I'm alive, yay me, and then it goes away within minutes, whereas before it would linger for like an hour of a deposition. And it has also completely changed my approach. I know it's going to happen. I might feel self-conscious about it. That's okay. But if I just kind of move on quickly, I'm able to just move on and do the substance of my work. And it doesn't distract me like it used to. I see a lot of law students or young associates who have different manifestations of stress, like they sweat or they shake or they feel like their voices are shaking. So there's ways to kind of reframe our relationships with those reactions too, like people whose hands shake. If you shake your hands out, 10 times you take the podium, it can sort of do something to make it feel like you're getting the energy, adrenaline or excess energy out of your system, and then you're able to kind of move forward. So I just suggest that people experiment with different things like that and don't dwell on those physical manifestations as such a weakness like I used to, because it's not. Who cares? I turn red, big deal. Move on.
Right. Yeah, I remember when I was just getting started, my mentor, who unfortunately came to watch my first trial, which was a disaster, said two things to me that I never forgot, and I always do in terms of physical stance. He said, stop moving around so much. He said, pick a spot and stand there. And because he was right, I was distracting myself. It was very distracting to look at me pacing and walking all over the place. And he also said, when you stand up for the first time in front of a judge or in front of a jury, always say your name loud and clear, because you're not going to forget your name, your own name. And as soon as you've said your name, Aaron Freiwald for the plaintiff, Your Honor, now I'm speaking. Now I'm past that moment where, oh my God, I'm going to have to start speaking soon. I'm speaking. And it's just a little thing, but it helps. For me, it helps in turning, making sure I acknowledge now the lights are on and I'm okay to get going here. And you have
it does, and that's that's like the sort of the pregame rituals you alluded to. Is that's part of your pregame, and what I learned for me is that if, like, again, this is sort of an athlete analogy, but many athletes have these pregame rituals and they're not superstitions. I'm not talking about superstitions, but what you described, like how you're going to stand, how you're going to stand up, saying your name. And for me, I like to do the power pose thing when I stand there. Even if I'm in front of people already, I'll stand there with my hands on my hips, and it just makes me feel like, okay, I'm about to get ready. Then I'm going to kickstart my good soundtrack. Then I'm going to stand in a balanced stance, and then I'm going to say my name, and then I'm going to go. And just treating it like a performer would really helps us do well. And I when I was researching this, the singer Chris Martin of the band Coldplay, he admitted in some column that he does 18 different things before he goes on stage, and not superstition stuff, exactly the type of stuff that we're talking about. And I thought that was so fascinating because I just wouldn't have thought about that, and as far as what rock stars do when they take the stage, but if it's okay for them to do it, why isn't it okay for lawyers to do it?
Right. We don't see what goes on backstage. We just see the guy coming out onto stage looking all fantastic and confident. And it's reminding me, too, of the great scene in the first Rocky movie, one of my favorite movies. The night of the big fight, he can't sleep, and he goes to the arena, which is empty. But there's a real psychological benefit to doing that before you're in the moment of performance. And you even talk about, say, a law student who may be nervous about going to meet with a professor for the first time. And you say, go to the professor's office, see where it's located. Maybe you'll even get a glance inside the office so you'll see how it's laid out. So then when you're there in the moment, it may seem less stressful. It's less foreign to you. You have some familiarity with it, and that can help ease the stress which a lot of us feel in that type of a situation. There's a lot of really good practical tips and things to think about, because we all, no matter what you think you see in somebody when you are seeing them performing, whether it's Chris Martin or you in front of a classroom or me in front of a jury, there is all that stuff backstage going on in all of us. And so I think I really just say again, what a fantastic story, a really I think really important book for everybody, not just law students. And I know that's your focus, but I see this as really applying to everybody. Again, any type of workplace you work in, whether it's down at the waterfront or in a large office building, or in any relationship, because we have to perform in relationships too. We have to be engaged in conversation. We have to deal with conflict. I mean, all kinds of things that come up. And so much in this book that I think we could all learn from. So I really appreciate that I had a chance to read the book and come to know it, and that I've had a chance to talk with you and share this conversation with our listeners. Heidi Brown from Brooklyn Law School, but from so many other fascinating places. Thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed speaking with you about it.